Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. My name is Alex. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. And it's great to be hosting and being part of another event for Much of the Living Australia. I'm very excited about our guest today. I'll tell you in a minute why I'm so excited to hear from him. But let me begin by acknowledging that I'm in Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to acknowledge the traditional lands of wherever it is that you're sitting and where you're meeting, whether it be in Australia. I know we've got people from Sydney and Perth as well as Melbourne, or whether it be in Israel or elsewhere. I know our guest is coming to us from Israel, so I want to welcome him. As I said, I'm particularly excited about this presentation, partly because I've known our guest for about 25 years, correct me if I'm wrong, but something like that. And partly because I've recently been to Poland and to the Nozyk Synagogue in Warsaw, where our guest was an assistant rabbi there for a number of years. So for that reason, I'm particularly excited to be hosting and bringing us this presentation. If you've read the flyer for today, you'll know that Rabbi Yona Daniel Simons was born in Sydney to a father whose family moved to Australia in the mid-1800s, and a mother descendant from Holocaust survivors who arrived in Sydney in 1960. He worked in IT, then went to Yeshiva, gained Rabbinical Ordination, and was in Warsaw as an assistant rabbi 2009 to 2012. Since then, although he's currently in Israel, he continues to teach on life in Poland. I know he and his wife continue to regularly visit back to Poland. And so it's very exciting for us to hear about an Australian reflection on life in Poland. So Rabbi Yona Daniel Simons in Israel, over to you.
Hey guys. So I'm Yona. I hope my accent is understandable. It's a bit of a running joke with some of my co-workers here about whether apparently I have a strong accent or not, that I will leave that aside. So I want to start with a ridiculous, controversial statement that hopefully I will wind back as time goes on. Everything you heard growing up in Australia about Jewish life in Poland before the war and after the war is completely based on truth, and all of it is completely false. Now, this is contradictory. This doesn't really make sense. And I will give you some examples that are a bit softer to start off, and we'll get to understand what this means for people who are living in Poland now and what it means for us. So the first weird example I want to give is I was learning Jewish history in Moriah College in 1989 in year 10, and we had a textbook that was talking about terrible things that happened during the Holocaust, but there was a photo of a Jewish school in Poland before the war. It was just a random photo, but it actually had documentation. It said which city it was in, it said what year it was taken, and it said what kind of school it was. And being an Australian, where the concept of a government faith school is almost foreign, I was like, so I said naively to my Jewish history teacher, I said, well, I always heard that Jews were treated very poorly in Poland, but if Jews are treated so poorly, like, why does the government run Jewish schools? Now, that's a naive question. You could give other answers like, well, if the Jews are all in their own separate school, we can allocate them less funding, whatever your example is. But why I'm mentioning that is that my teacher, who was quite well educated, had no answer to that. This was in a book that he'd been using for years, and he never thought to state, how can this country, which has such a poor attitude to Jews, be running Jewish schools? Why aren't they just like stereotypical stories we heard? Like my mother told me growing up in a communist country, in Romania, they were shoved into non-Jewish schools and forced to conform. Now, the answer is that my teacher had no good answer to this because my teacher did not understand the circumstances, nor did anyone ever tried to state that. I'll give you another weird example. So we were visited by a group from Melbourne, a group of Jews that were quite Hasidic in their orientation. So they were really keen to hear about activities of Hasidic Jews in Poland, in Warsaw before the war. And this is getting a bit specific, but they were asking about which siddur we used. And the type of siddur that was used in the shul was, I'll use the technical term here, Nosach Ashkenaz, basically a non-Hasidic siddur. And these people stated, oh, does this mean that the people who've moved here to help Jews after the war have brought in the siddur they're used to using? But really, this is not the siddur people would have used in Warsaw before the war. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, the religious Jews in Poland were mostly Hasidic. And I said, why do you say that? He says, well, we're all Polish people, grew up from Polish families, and we were told this. And I said, my understanding is that's completely not true. And I'll try and bring you an academic proof. I said, no. I said, there were 3 million Jews in Poland. If there are 3 million Jews, there are lots of different kinds of Jews. I said, there were a number of different Sidurim translated into Polish before the war. Sidurim, Machzorim for festivals. These prayer books were translated, there would be Hebrew and Polish. None of them are of the Hasidic style. They are all in the non-Hasidic style. And they said, well, maybe the people of Hasidic style don't need translations. I said, I don't know. So I've only got the evidence that sits in front of my eyes. All of the translations we've found, we have not found a single translation. Now, there were definitely Sidurim produced in Poland of a Hasidic style. But the narrative people had been given that all Jews in Poland were these, black garb wearing Hasidim, and the less religious Jews just followed along in their track, was not transmitted correctly. Okay, once again, there were plenty of Hasidim in Poland, but here's another example of the story we heard is completely based on truth, but it's not the reality. And I'll give you a further extension of that. There are countless photos from before the war of the city of Krakow full of black garb wearing Hasidim. And people started spreading stories about what a Hasidic city Krakow was. So when I went there, I asked the locals. And the locals say that Krakow, which was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918, was a very snobby city. And before the war, people in Krakow refused to speak Yiddish. If someone would turn up, a Jew would turn up to them and speak to them in Yiddish, they would answer them in German. So, but what about all these photos of Hasidim? Until someone pointed out that all of the photos were taken on the same day of the year. Now, people might be aware that today, Hasidim especially, although other groups too, on Lag BaOmer, a certain date in the Jewish calendar, make a point of visiting the apparent burial site of a great Jewish rabbi from 2,000 years ago, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Before the war, they would visit the grave of the Rama, Rav Moshe Isserles, who died in Krakow at the age of 39 in the late 1500s. And his grave would be visited before the war. And one day a year, all of these Hasidim would come on trains and would appear there. And these Hasidim stood out from the locals. But the other Polish Jews didn't stand out so much from the locals, and they didn't make such a great photo. They were just people dressed slightly differently. Maybe they had a cap or a head covering, I don't know. So once again, what we heard before is completely based on truth, but it's not actually the reality. And once again, this doesn't devalue anything you heard from your parents and grandparents. What it really means about all of these things is do not generalize. Don't say all the Jews before the war in Poland were this kind of Jew. When you think about how many Jews you have in Australia, there's barely more than 100,000. You think of all the Jewish communities in Australia. If there are 3 million Jews, and not only that, the proximity of those Jews to other countries. Another example, the number of observant Sephardi Jews in Poland before the war is significantly greater than the number of observant Sephardi Jews in Australia today, right? Why? Because Poland is not that far from Yugoslav countries that had similar languages, but were mainly Sephardi, let alone other parts of the former Turkish Empire. And there were Sephardi Jews in Poland. Were they a significant minority? Yes, but they were there. When you have 3 million Jews at the end of the day, and some Sephardim went to shuls where there were Ashkenazis. Famously, there was one city in Poland where the Sephardim outnumbered the Ashkenazim, which is a separate amusing story, which is the city of Zamość, which is somewhat off the beaten track. Some of the groups go there because it's not that far from Lublin. But the city of Zamość had a Sephardi community because apparently many, many years ago, in the 1700s, a Polish king wanted to set up an artistic city, and he invited people from around the world. And he said, I already have a lot of Jews. I want different Jews. And Zamość actually was probably only 3 or 4 days wagon ride, if not slightly longer walk ride from the Turkish Empire. And they invited a group of Sephardi Jews who set up a synagogue now, this famous Sephardi synagogue in Zamość. Now it's once again a museum. So once again, what you've heard is completely based on truth, but not necessarily correct. And then the next bit, which is I call the post-war narrative. So people here have visited Auschwitz, right? So probably the most striking personal thing in the Auschwitz Museum is the Hall of Luggage. And in the Hall of Luggage, what's so striking about it is that people wrote their names in very thick white paint, their names and their addresses on their bags. Now, why they did that, whether they did it themselves or whether they were encouraged to do that as a way to give them a false sense of security, you know, when you walk in there, you literally can read a time capsule. Now, when you look closely, the vast majority of that luggage are the names of Jews with very heavy Dutch-German focus, although a number of Dutch Jews have very Sephardi ancestry, from Holland. It's clear, you can see the addresses. So in 1946, the Auschwitz Museum as we know today was built. And it was built by a heavily communist-backed regime. And the reason for building that museum was to publicize and promote the fact that the Soviets had liberated Poland. And in fact, until the 1980s, the word Jew was barely mentioned in any of the discussions or signage at the museum. It was compulsory for many school-age people to go there at various points in order to learn about how the Soviets, the communists, had liberated the Poles from the terrors of fascism. And my neighbor growing up, who actually grew up in Poland, so this is my neighbor's, the parents, generation above me, she grew up in Poland and moved to Australia in the 50s and spoke a small amount of Polish. And she ended up visiting the Auschwitz Museum with her husband in the mid-70s. And they went into the Hall of Luggage. And you see these names. It's the same Hall of Luggage, clearly Jewish names. And she said to the people, that says, oh, and these about these Jewish people here. And the guide there said, what Jewish people? The people imprisoned in Auschwitz were Polish prisoners of fascism. Now, the truth is, the original camp was set up for Polish political prisoners. But the Hall of Luggage belies, the Hall of Luggage is all Jews, and they are not Polish Jews. Very clearly, it says on their addresses. And despite the fact that it said on every piece of luggage that the people were from Holland, the guide said, no Jews, this is Polish people who are persecuted. The next post-war issue. Intermarriage is a weird issue for us to deal with in Australia. Classically, it's a low percentage thing in Australia. I'm not going to get into discussions of why supposedly intermarriage rate in Adelaide is lower than it's in New York. This is a separate discussion. But what's difficult to understand is that in Poland, from 1946, the intermarriage rate was 97%. Now, this is important. My mother grew up in Romania. The intermarriage rate in Romania eventually reached the high 80%, but not the year after the war. In fact, the year after the war, a lot of people did not intermarry, non-Jews as well, even if they liked and loved their Jewish, they just simply couldn't imagine setting up their life with the person who might be literally shipped off to a death camp the next year, right? It really literally created that feeling. My mother talks about how in the 50s, the main barrier to things like intermarriage and integration in Romania was that people were afraid of being tagged as being Jewish, having their children tagged as being Jewish, whether they liked or disliked Jews. For whatever reason, this was not a factor in Poland. In fact, I have this weird scenario. I took one of my parents to Krakow on a train. There were three adults and 2 little children sitting in, and 2 other people were put in the carriage. We were worried what they would think about my little kids, my twins, who weren't of age yet. And ironically, it was a Polish couple from Altona. By Polish, I mean not Jewish at all. And we're like, okay, I hadn't been living in Poland, having a chat with them. These people, this lady, her sister, right? Her sister married a Jewish man in 1947 and eventually moved to Israel. And all of her kids, basically her grandnieces and grandnephews grew up in Israel. But she moved at some point, while her sister moved to Israel because of her Jewish husband. She moved to Melbourne. I asked her if she knew much about the Melbourne Jewish community. I didn't know what to tell her. And she talked about what she knew, especially she knew that everybody knew about Glick's Bakery. Over the years, when I asked Polish people, not Jewish, who visited Melbourne, constantly, everybody knew about Glick's Bakery. And an interesting thing, I don't know whether it was one non-Jewish Polish person a week or one a day or one a month visiting Glick's Bakery. But I then had the fortune of visiting Glick's Bakery in Melbourne a few months later. And old Mr. Glick was there. This was in 2010. And I asked him a question about the bread in Polish, and his eyes lit up. Then I said, oh, wait a second, you're speaking too slowly. You're speaking too quick for me. My Polish is bad, right? I said, speak slower. And non-Jewish Polish people would visit Glick's Bakery. And once again, were they going there simply because they liked the bread? Maybe they didn't like Mr. Glick. I've got no idea. But there's a connection there. And this relates heavily to this weird integration of Jewish and non-Jewish people. So I want to add one more weird story from that. In Poland, after the war, people were not identified as being Jewish. Now, why is this important? Because before the war, everyone was identified. Interesting, there was no definition of religion. There was what was called nationality, which is also weird, because you could be called Ukrainian, even though you're a Polish citizen. You could be called a Jew. It's like, well, maybe you're a Jew from Lvov, and that's sort of Ukrainian. That's what it was called. After the war, in order to discourage religion, and nobody had their religion mentioned. So I had a student, actually he was a translator in Łódź. I know it's Lodz, but it's called Łódź in modern Polish, or in ancient Polish. And his father successfully hid his Judaism from the Nazis throughout the entire war. He lived in plain sight as a non-Jew, and no one ever fingered him or identified him as a Jew. In 1968, there was a certain persecution after the Six-Day War of Jews in Poland. Exactly the purpose and nature of that persecution for another time. And this man was fingered in 1968 as a Jew, and he lost his job and a variety of other things. And this guy Zev told me, his father committed suicide. He could not understand how the Nazis never found out he was a Jew, yet the Polish government did. I have to point out that in 1968, the Polish government performed a census and announced there were only 38,000 Jews in Poland, and through a variety of discriminatory measures, convinced 35,000 of them to leave. They document the statistics of this, implying that there were only 3,000 Jews left in Poland by the end of 1968. It is now quite clear that there were many more than that. And now, once again, why they didn't know? So I'll get into my next story. So I talked about my translator in Łódź. So I get to Poland, the best proper organized Jewish community in Poland, other than Warsaw, is Łódź. Another discussion for another time. And one more story about Łódź. Łódź is the only Jewish community in Poland where synagogue has a Masorah, a tradition. That is, they sing the same tunes as was sung by at least one synagogue in Łódź before the war. Now, before the war, there were 250,000 Jews. There were many synagogues of many different types. But someone described to me a chazan. Firstly, there was a rabbi in Łódź who refused to leave, even though the communists encouraged him to. There was a chazan who also stayed around, and they taught some young people tunes. So I was in Łódź, and I would give a lesson. And most of the people there only spoke Polish, and I spoke none. And my translator would translate from English into Polish. But there was a guy up the back who would speak to me in Hebrew, an old guy. Like, you know, that old guy who turns up to synagogue. He turns up all the time. I guess he's retired, doesn't have much to do. He enjoys the company. And I could speak to him in basic Hebrew. So I actually had a relationship to him. And not only that, many people could not say any word of the prayers. He knew all the prayers. So a couple of months later, I was there for Shabbat, and he was singing a song in Hebrew to my older son. And I asked him where he learned it, and he said he learned it on his first day of school in Hebrew school in Lvov, now called Lviv in modern day Ukraine, in 1935, I believe he said, 1932. Sorry, in 1932. And so I talked to him a bit about it. And he went to a Jewish school in Lvov and he learned Hebrew. It was a school very associated with Bnei Akiva. I have to actually add that a significant portion of the people who died in Kfar Etzion, at the massacre at Kfar Etzion of what's become Yom HaZikaron in Israel, were actually from a Garin, a group of Bnei Akiva people from Lvov who moved to Israel. And interesting, a bunch of them are Holocaust survivors and survived the Holocaust and unfortunately died then in their wars for Israeli independence. But where I hear about this story was from a different person in Łódź, who actually was from Lvov. A lot of people moved from Lvov to Łódź after the war. And he was telling me about his friends there. But let's get back to Binyamin. So Binyamin is always there. And at a certain point, I said to Binyamin, when did you come to the Jewish community, to this synagogue? When did you start coming to this synagogue in Łódź? This is 2009. And he goes, 4 years ago, 2005. And I'm like, okay. You went to other synagogues in between? He goes, no. I said, where did you live? And he named a town that's about 20 minutes by train out of Lvov. And I said, I guess you just didn't know about the synagogue. He goes, yeah, I knew about the synagogue. Says, you didn't know the other Jews? He goes, yeah, I knew other Jews when I met them. Basically, Binyamin in 1946, having grown up in Lvov, he was sent east by the Soviets at a certain point in time. Then in 1943, when he turned 16, he was drafted, or 17, he was drafted into the Soviet army. In 1946, he was mustered out and given the choice. He can move back to Lvov and live in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, or he can move to Poland. He said he's moving to Poland. He moved to Łódź. He met a non-Jewish woman. He married her. In 2005, his wife died. He had children by then. And no longer living with his non-Jewish wife, he moved back into the Jewish community. And he was one of the only people I met there who could actually say the prayers. And he lived for 59 years as a non-Jew. I don't understand it. Like all the things I've been told about why somebody lives as a Jew, and I can understand being terrified of whatever happened to you in Poland, in former Soviet countries. What kind of experiences? I want to add one more story. The synagogue in Łódź is currently run in a small room. They have a big synagogue that's a community property, but it's not very comfortable unless there's large groups. The bima, right, they read the Torah from. The amud, which is a stand that's used for saying the prayers. The Aron Kodesh, the Aron, the cupboard, the Sefer Torah is kept in, and the Sefer Torah are original from a synagogue in Łódź before the war. When the ghetto was put together, and the Jews were moved out of there, the Jews from that particular building didn't know what to do with the stuff, and they simply put these 3 pieces of furniture and the Torah in the ark in the basement. In 2006, somebody calls up the Jewish community in Łódź and says, hey guys, I've got this stuff we found. We're clearing out a building because we're demolishing it. It's Jewish. Do you guys want it? Now, finding wooden furniture is interesting. But inside of the Aron was a Sefer Torah that had not been touched since the Liechtenstein ghetto was put together in 1940. Just sitting there. These people asked for no money. Now, don't be mistaken. Plenty of people have turned up with Sefer Torah and asked for money for it. Someone once turned up with the Megillah that his family had acquired, and he asked, and we said straight away, this is a real kosher Megillah. We'll pay you $250 for it. That's what it's worth. And he said, but I heard it's worth $10,000. That's like, it's not a Sefer Torah, it's a Megillah. And they're like, we don't believe you. Okay. So there are people who wanted money, but these people here gave it to the people. So another modern character story that shows a weird circumstance. I had a student in Warsaw called Bartek Serdakovsky Goldstein. His grandfather's name was Goldstein. Like, surely that's a Jewish name. And this guy here was apparently a very stubborn, very annoying Jewish man. He actually only died a few months before I got there. And he never changed his name. And he was a stubborn old you-know-what. That his children changed their name in order not to be identified as Jews. And so one of his sons married a woman. And this woman knew she was marrying a man whose family was Jewish. And she was like, okay, I'm marrying you. And the son got more involved with Jewish communities, but was informed, you don't have a Jewish mother, so although you're very welcome to come in as someone with a Jewish family, you're not Jewish. So he started digging into his family. Without going into the story, when they went through archives, they found evidence that his mother's family was Jewish. Now, the concept of someone hiding their Judaism is clear and understandable. But the concept of somebody who was marrying someone who was publicly known to be from a Jewish family who originally had a completely Jewish surname, which they changed. Because when my student approached his mother with the story, he found she started to reel off names of all the people she knew about the Jews in her family. She never even told her husband, who had a Jewish family, that she had Jewish family. So once again, if she really didn't want to be identified as Jewish, well, why didn't she just marry a man who wasn't Jewish? Very not clear. A similar, difficult story of a student. This man was more my age, who had Jewish siblings, but they were much older than him. And only later on he realized that his father's first wife, who was Jewish, had died in some kind of health issue. And he remarried 10 years later, a non-Jewish woman. And for him to suddenly find out that his older brothers living in Israel are Jewish and he's not but once again, the issues of what kind of person, I mean, you're Jewish or you're not. And we talk about assimilation as you decide not to be Jewish. What does it mean? When does someone decide they're Jewish in Poland? So I have to state that people walk into the synagogue every day and claim to be Jewish. Many of them literally are nut jobs. Some of them might feel some form of guilt for suffering Jews felt in Poland. Some of them might simply be people who are who found out weird family secrets. But the one that really identifies it most to me is an individual calls up Rabbi Shudrich, the chief rabbi of Poland, and he says, listen, my mother was diagnosed yesterday with a terminal illness. She has 3 months to live. And she starts talking to me about her family. And lo and behold, she reveals that her family is Jewish. So what should we do? Rabbi Shudrich says, well, your mother's sick. Let's make an appointment. I will meet her, go meet her, whatever it is exactly. Let's do it. So they made an appointment for a week or two's time. So he calls up this woman the day before and says, okay, I'm going to come and meet your mother in the hospital. She goes, my mother doesn't want to meet you. I'm okay. Is everything okay? My mother said she lied. She's not really Jewish. Okay. I mean, if she's not Jewish, she's not Jewish. Is everything okay? She goes, yeah. She just got news from a second opinion of a doctor that she's probably got 2 or 3 years to live and not 3 months to live. So now she's not Jewish. I mean, once again, easy for me growing up in this environment in Australia. What do people feel about it? Now, the question is, why do people either want to be Jewish or not want to be Jewish? I mean, in theory, you should decide what you want to be. I met a priest at an event, actually. It is later in my time in Poland, so lucky I was less naive than some of those earlier times. And this priest, a practicing Catholic priest, said to me, I'm so proud to tell you that I am Jewish. I'm going, what, you no longer wish to be a Catholic priest? Or you used to be Jewish, but decided that Catholicism is the religion you follow? He goes, no. I am a Catholic priest, and I am Jewish. And I tell my congregation this when it matters, when it's relevant in the discussions. And at some level, and I can't say he's right or wrong, this Catholic priest thinks he's a better Catholic priest to preach what he needs to preach and to help people how he needs to help them because he's Jewish. I don't know if there are people here familiar with Catholicism, but in Catholicism, what you could call the comparison to what's called teshuvah, repentance in Judaism, is only possible with the assistance of a priest. Yes, you need to in yourself want to be a better person and make up for the terrible things you may have done. But you actually need to go to a priest to get absolution. You can't do it yourself. People would find out I was a rabbi and say, I'm unhappy with my local priest. Can you please do this for me so I can do repentance? I'm talking about non-Jews. And I'm like, well, I mean, if you want to do repentance, so talk to God. Like, whatever. I mean, if you're doing something terrible, I guess you should stop doing it. If you're no longer doing terrible things, but you used to, try and find a way to make up for it. He says, but you're a rabbi. You can give me, like, I can't get into heaven unless you do this for me. I'm like, wow. So leave aside Catholic philosophy. That's not our business here. It's like, but I'm a rabbi. Like, why should I matter? I'm Jewish. How can I help you? Yet these individuals very much felt that. So Polish people would turn up to Jewish events all the time. Now, why they turned up to this event is a good question. Firstly, they would turn up and demand kosher food. Not like I have a dietary restriction, I can only eat. It's literally, I want to eat kosher food. I've heard so much about kosher food. I want to eat it. And so there would be events where they would cater much more kosher food than the local Jewish community or even the visitors could ever want, because they want to eat kosher food. They heard about kosher food. So it's actually quite funny. There is a former sort of kosher restaurant around the corner from the Nozik Synagogue in Plac Dzibowska that's right next to a very large church. And this church is one of the most popular places to do first communions. Lahavdil, you could almost compare it to a bar or bat mitzvah for Catholics. It's a slightly younger age, probably 7, 8, or 9. But first communions, they would go normally on a Sunday morning, but not necessarily, to this church and go to this restaurant next door that's called the Menorah Restaurant. And they would eat a festive lunch there. And the main dishes at this restaurant that people would go to have a festive lunch after their first communion with their children, the main dishes they would have would be chicken soup with kreplach and gefilte fish, right? Now, the gefilte fish is called, I don't know how familiar people are with Polish, ryba żydowska, which actually means Jewish fish. Now, what's wrong with the discussion of Jewish fish? So one day, an Israeli businessman, who was only sort of traditionally keeping kosher, he was visiting a town in Poland in the mid-2000s, and he went to this little cafe. And he always used to, when he got a place, he didn't want to eat non-kosher meat, and many places would serve gefilte fish, and he would ask for the ryba żydowska, Jewish fish. And one day, he goes to a place in another town, and he asks for ryba żydowska, Jewish fish. And the guys bring him these skewers, these wooden disposable skewers, with medium-sized whole fish on the skewer, roasted on an open fire. Now, for some people, that's actually quite unappetizing. And he was like, excuse me, this is not what I ordered. I ordered ryba żydowska. And it's like, this is ryba żydowska. So the guy brings his grandfather out, the guy running it, out from the back of the cafe. And he's like, the guy says, it's not ryba żydowska. And he goes, it's now, the guy around the cafe spoke a bit of English. The grandfather did. He translates, he says, before the war, Jewish business people would come to my cafe and they would want to eat. And the only thing they could eat was fish, which they cooked themselves over an open fire using a disposable wooden skewer. That's Jewish fish. Everybody knew when Jewish people wanted to eat fish, this is what you would do. You would cook them fish over an open fire on a skewer. Now, those days, people did a lot of cooking with fire anyway. And it's like, what relationship did these people have with Jews before the war? So one day in my Beit Midrash in Warsaw, this Israeli couple comes in and they're like, I don't understand. My mother always told me how difficult it was living in Poland. And we understand it was difficult. And so we don't understand what she just told us. I said, what did she tell you? So we were walking through this park in between memorials. And she goes, I used to play in this park as a child. Well, like, it was a park for children. Yeah, there was children's play equipment. I mean, it wasn't like we have now. There was children's play equipment, swings, slides, merry-go-rounds, simple ones. It's like, okay. And you only played, you're like, you only played alone, right? Said, no, we played with other kids. Well, it was only Jewish kids, obviously. No, there were non-Jewish kids. Obviously, those non-Jewish kids didn't know you were Jewish. I was, no, they knew we were Jewish. So obviously, they didn't tell their parents. I said, what do you mean? One of the mothers used to come up and say, oh, here's some food, but you can't have this food because it's not kosher here. You can have some fruit. Now, they said, but my mother never said she had a single Jewish friend before the war. Non-Jewish friend before the war. And it's like, let's not oversimplify things. I want to tell you a very difficult story that you can understand in so many ways. That was only recently uncovered in Yad Vashem. So as you may know, the highest number of righteous among the nations, which is an interesting classification for another time, in the world is in Poland. Now, in theory, this is mathematical. There are many more Jews in Poland, and many Jews were taken through Poland by the Germans. So a person who had deep in their soul their spark to save the life of another, for nothing other than that was the right reason, it makes sense that such people were in Poland, regardless of whether people in Poland liked Jews more or less than other parts of Europe. Statistically, there should be more in Poland, but it outnumbers enormously. But stories of righteous among the nations are complicated because it's not just a badge that says thank you. If you're a righteous among the nations, it's a government classification that entitles you to make aliyah to Israel. So it's very strict. The rules are very strict. So it gets investigated very heavily. You don't just simply say, I don't know, Mr. Kowalski apparently was nice to Jews. We actually find proper information because them and their children and grandchildren are entitled to move to Israel and get allowances and so on and so on. So there was a story of a small town, of a family that was saved. And they talked about the weird relationship they had with the people who saved them. Because they were their sort of neighbors, they sort of knew them, but didn't know them well. But they offered them shelter at a certain point, and for years, they lived in a basement in these people's house, and they would feed them and everything. And what would happen is the neighbors would visit. And when the neighbors visited, they would vomit out the most disgusting vitriol about Jews, about how much better their town was since the Jews were all sent away, and how the Germans aren't also bad because at least they got rid of the Jews, and so on and so on and so on. And their hosts would join in. They would join in with these disgusting statements. And they said in their testimony about the righteous among the nations that every time the neighbor left, the host would come down to them and hug them and cry and say, I'm so sorry I'm saying these terrible things. But it's so important they don't suspect me, not just for me, but for you. If they suspect me, they'll find you. So I have to say these terrible things. Please forgive me. Obviously, if I'm risking my life to save you, I don't believe them, but just, it hurts me. And the story was told multiple times to Yad Vashem. And Yad Vashem is categorized. But Yad Vashem has a problem. The names of the family are not the same in both testimonies. In fact, in one of the testimonies, they named the other family, as in the nasty anti-Semitic family, as being the family that supposedly sheltered the Jews. And it was assumed that this was a misremembering after whatever these families went through. Until they finally did research and they found records of where people lived in that town and actually discovered that both families of supposedly anti-Semitic non-Jews sheltered a Jewish family, and when their anti-Semitic neighbor came over, would join in the vitriol. It was the same story. Now there's two takeouts from this story. The first thing is, wow, how many people we thought hated Jews actually risked their lives to save Jews. But there's a separate point. If really everyone in Poland loved Jews before the war, then there would have been no need to fake their anti-Semitism, right? It would have been obvious that before the war, you used to love, I don't know, eating kreplach and gefilte fish or whatever it is that made you love Jews. But on the other hand, and it got to the level where even the non-Jews didn't trust that their neighbors weren't really anti-Semitics. So there were clearly people with very poor attitudes to Jews. But on the other hand, there were others who were not. And this is so clear in the questions I was asked by Polish people. When I used to travel to Łódź to give lessons by train. I would try and prepare my lessons on the train, but I couldn't, because people would come up to me all the time and ask me questions, all the time, nonstop, everything. And some of the people had Jewish family or friends. Some of them had no connection to Judaism, and they wanted to know everything about Judaism because it's in their towns. Because every town in Poland has an old synagogue, and some of them are derelict, and some of them have been beautifully rebuilt. I met a Jewish person who, when he came back from wherever he was sent by the Russians or the Germans, he moved to this really weird little town. I said, "Why'd you move to this non-Jewish town?" And he said, "There's no such thing as a non-Jewish town in Poland. No such thing." I tried to compare this for an American audience. I said, just imagine. So New York currently has 2 million Jews. And actually, it's less so now than it was. 50 years ago, there was barely an area in New York that was not Jewish. Currently, there are many of these areas that are no longer Jewish. Imagine telling a Jew from then, I moved to a non-Jewish area of New York. I have to say, it's actually happened. There are areas of parts of the Bronx and other parts of New York that are now have all these closed synagogues. But the concept of saying it, how can it be? Basically, as always, the stories are more complicated than we hear. So I have plenty more to tell, as you can sort of hear. I've gone on for 40 or so minutes. But I do wish to ask if there are any questions people have that may be irrelevant for me to answer.
Well, thank you. As predicted, your stories are endlessly fascinating, and I'm sure you could go on for ages. But I think the first question, which I know some people are interested in, is why did someone of Romanian heritage, who's an Australian, move to Poland in the first place?
This is more career oriented. I already had a career in computing, which is what I do in Israel. I wanted to teach adults, and I struggled to find communities where adult education was important. And because people in Poland had such poor access to Judaism, literally from the end of the Second World War, which was different to other countries, adults were not embarrassed to say, I need to learn. And too many of the Jewish communities I approached, if I was interested in going out in shlichut, wanted school teachers or community rabbis and said, on the side, you can teach adults. So I wanted to teach adult education. I was very impressed by adults in Poland being very open to saying, yes, I know nothing and I want to know more. Do I want to keep it? I don't know, but I want to know about it. And not only that, like teaching, I would occasionally in Australia or in Chile, my wife's from Chile, teach Torah in a place where I could think, who would have taught this before? But in Poland, it's just like, how many people taught this before? And I have to add to this I didn't even thought of. So many nuances of Jewish writings have enormous Polish impacts on them, both in language and in culture. Enormous. The fruits and vegetables they were eating. And it's amazing how I then gave feedback to people that they never imagined because they didn't understand it, because context is everything. And I want to add one more bit to that. Once I was contacted, there was a lecture on terrorism being given by an academic of Jewish origin. They said, you know what? We want to put a shiur. So you can give a shiur on terrorism. I said, okay. So I said, well, since they're academics, I'll give a shiur quoting sources by a rabbi from the 1500s. And all of the students of this academic turned up and said, we want to hear from Polish academics from the 1500s. You say it's a Jewish rabbi. He wrote 15 books. I guess he's an academic. So yeah, there was a connection to Poland that's missing in these other countries. So yes, I have no connection to Poland. It really just happened to me. They wanted me, and therefore I went. It was as simple as that, I guess.
Okay, well, that's fascinating, and thank you. And for me, at least, and I'm sure possibly for others, these stories have a lot more resonance now that I've been to some of these places. We didn't go to Łódź this time, but we went to many of the other places you mentioned. And one of the questions we had was, do you know anything about Jews of Chelm?
Chelm. Are you talking about Chelm as in the semi-legendary city where people were supposedly less intelligent than other cities?
It seems that's the question, yes.
Okay, so Chelm is a real city. I am not sure where the stereotype of the people being less than intelligent came from, some kind of Lahavdil Chernobyl-oriented concept that the water was not good for brain development. I met a small number of Jews from Chelm, and many of them were not even aware, other than cultural passing, that this stereotype existed. It was just another place that formerly housed the Jewish community.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Does any? I'm sure we could hear more anecdotes and stories, but does anyone have any more questions or comments before we move on? Maybe for another 10 minutes or so of stories. Any other questions? It doesn't seem so. So maybe you can continue. I'm sure you've got more stories to tell.
Of a different student of mine. So there was a guy who was becoming more religious when I moved there. He actually now, interestingly, he married a Ukrainian girl who moved to Berlin when she was a small child. But when I got there, he had already found information that his mother was definitely Jewish, but he was researching his father's family. And they went through archives. Once again, during the communist times, it was not documented if someone was Jewish or not. But before they were. And so his father's mother, actually maybe his father's grandmother, apparently converted to Judaism in Bnei Akiva circles in a small town near Poznan in the 1930s. So how do we know this? Because the secret police were following her. Now, why were the Polish secret police following this woman with a Bnei Akiva Jewish boyfriend? I don't know if that was such a religious Bnei Akiva group, that he was dating a non-Jew or not, or just a very traditional. I cannot comment. But it sounds quite anti-Semitic. But then we actually saw the files. See, Bnei Akiva was known as a Jewish socialist youth group. They wanted to settle the land in a socialist fashion. And if you think the Red Scare in Australia and in the United States was bad in the 50s, in Eastern Europe, it was terrible in the 30s. And it was real. There was reams and reams of documents of them investigating Bnei Akiva groups, suspecting that they would collaborate with communists to bring communism to Poland or to bring the Soviet Union to Poland. And they considered converting to Judaism the same as converting to communism. Now, we can find this sad or happy. And once again, does this show dislike of Judaism, or does this show some kind of reds under the beds attitude? I don't know. But the fact remains, the only reason he was able to prove that his father was halakhically Jewish was by finding secret police documentation where they followed around a female relative of his who converted to Judaism because they were checking to see whether they were planning the communist takeover in Poland. They found they weren't. They found these people would get together on a Friday night and would sit around and would eat and drink. And they wouldn't talk politics. They would talk halakha. They would talk about friends. And it was documented. Obviously, there was some insider in there. The banal Jewish topics that people at this Bnei Akiva Mifgash in the mid-30s of Bnei Akiva Bogrim, people who left youth groups already post-school age because one of them was getting married. And it was documented by the Polish secret police. And they never took any action against them because they found no evidence that they were involved with communism. But they suspected that this socialist youth group was doing it. And this provided the evidence that this person's family was Jewish, the fact that the secret police was checking him up. If I could talk about, I guess another interesting style of story. There are a number of synagogues in Poland that have been turned into museums. Some of these have been paid for by donations from families who formed a part of the community. And some of them were simply renovated as part of some kind of urban civics. There is a derelict building, we should make it beautiful. It's even now that what does a town need to be a real town in Poland? One of the things it needs is a synagogue. And every now and then someone comes to us and says, oh, my family's from this end of the town. I hear there's a synagogue there. Can we make a minyan there? And we would get someone from the community to call up. And this didn't always happen, but often happened. It would be like, Jews want to come and do proper Jewish prayers in the synagogue. Please tell us the times. We will close off the synagogue for tourists visiting at that time. People want to come and actually pray as Jews in our shul. That's amazing. We spent time and energy renovating this place. Someone should actually pray in it and not just have concerts in there. And then once again, what does that mean? You can tell me. But there's not a one-off. There are plenty of towns that will offer this in Poland. They're probably the most famous is the one of Kazimierz Dolny, that a number of Hasidic groups went there for Shabbat because they found evidence that before the war, Hasidim would go there for a Shabbaton, weekend away. And they would go there, and they would say they're coming. And the people would say, yeah, we know that you have all these special laws for Shabbat. So the museum will be locked from an hour before Shabbat till an hour after Shabbat. It will only be used for prayers. Anyone who wants to watch the prayers can look through the windows. That way, there'll be a men's section, a women's section. It'll all be the way you want it. Once again, understand this as you will. There is a certain seeing that Jews are a critical part of Polish history. And I would add here, I'll say something harsh. I based this on a story of one of my students. His father moved from Chicago to Warsaw in 1930. So his grandfather moved from Chicago to Warsaw in 1936. And I think, what kind of crazy person would do this? And they asked him, why did you move? And they said, there was too much anti-Semitism in Chicago. I said, what does that mean? And he goes, well, it's simple. In Chicago, I tell my boss, I don't want to work on Saturday. And he says, I'm firing you. And not only am I firing you, because I'm firing you, I'm going to deduct most of the wages you worked this week. Now, the same person might even rehire them the next Monday, but at much lower wages. It says in Poland, the boss might call me a stinking Jew and whatever, and say, okay, come to work on Monday. And that'll be that. Now, define anti-Semitism. At the time, there was terrible anti-Semitic issues in in universities in England. And this university group from England, we met with a group of Jewish students here in Israel, in Poland. And they said, tell us about the anti-Israel protests in Poland. And they're like, there are no anti-Israel protests we said, how can there be a university without anti-Israel protests? And we're like, well, once this speaker came to understand how Israelis are stealing Palestinian land. And like 5 people turned up, and most of them were from local Jewish students who simply wanted to see what was going on and to check what kind of crowd was going on and to investigate the anti-Semitism. Now, once again, let's not celebrate too much. In my opinion, a lot of this is based on the fact that people in Poland are very pro-Israel. They're pro-Israel for a number of reasons. Partly, they feel Israel was set up by Polish people. Partly, people in Poland, I'll say this very delicately, are very, very racist against other groups. They're very insular. I must say, not everyone's like this. To be Asian or black in Poland is not easy. Until recently, to be Ukrainian Polish was not easy. And very much to be an Arab in Poland is to be the subject of slurs. And the fact that they can say bad things about Arabs means they could probably easily say them about Jews. But people see Jews and Israel as a shield against what they don't like from Arabs. This is not a positive reason for there to be a lack of anti-Israel protests in universities. But nonetheless, students were struggling that in Poland, this terrible country, there were not anti-Israel protests at university. And in Australia and in England and America, there are anti-Israel protests at university. As I said, the story is complicated.
So on that point, one of the questions we have in the chat now is, what's your view on the current revisionist laws that exist in Poland, which I don't think were there when you were living there? I know you've been back there a few times. What's your view? They're not
there, but be careful about revisionism of the revisionism. Most of what certain Israeli groups say about those revisionist laws in Poland are revisionist themselves. They talk about, and this is unfortunately the main reason for revisionist laws in Poland are Israeli groups who turn up to Poland and describe Polish people perpetrating the Holocaust. Now we can discuss which Polish people, be it collaborated or if not collaborated, benefited from the Holocaust. And that is a valid discussion. But revisionism is a two-way street. And too many of the Israeli groups practiced in their own form of revisionism. And I do not support revisionist laws, but as I always state this, there are lots of anti-Semitic slurs we heard growing up that were somewhat thinly based on truth. The best example I can give you is a group of Jews during a robbery killed a servant in Chelsea in 1709. And until the time my parents were living in England in the 1970s, someone wanted to put down a Jew, they could say, go to Chelsea, because 250 years ago, some Jews killed somebody there. And they did. The Jews definitely killed someone there. That's a known fact. But they're implying that all Jews are murderers because this happened. We can't stand up and say all non-Jews are murderers, especially when we see how many of them are not. Were some of them terrible people? Yes. So I personally think that there are issues with the laws, but for example, when I spoke to the school groups that didn't go, the Ministry of Education mainly didn't go because they had bad actors who were offending their Polish hosts. It doesn't mean the Polish weren't too strict, and the current government is definitely tougher. But as I stated, in the end, the current Polish government has such close defense ties with Israel. The current Polish government is dedicated to exports to Israel, like meat exports. There was a supposed ban on kosher meat being produced in Poland, which was never fully enforced. But most people don't realize that was actually a ban on halal meat and relates heavily to anti-Islam. I personally think that the current revisionist issues are exaggerated, mostly, unfortunately, by Jewish revisionists. And I'm very careful on that because someone will tell me their grandfather was persecuted and heavily at the hand of Polish people, and who am I to tell them they're wrong? But when you turn up in a place and you literally say, everybody here hates you, that sounds to me like anti-Semitism when you say, the Jews all want to kill our babies. So there are definitely people in Poland who are not nice to Jews and don't like Jews. But we can't turn up and be those people and say all Polish people are terrible. So yeah, this is my feeling about the revisionism. I want to add one more thing. Poland is the only country in Europe that has memorials for Jews who were killed during and post-Holocaust, and it states on those memorials that they were killed by insert name of nationality, the local nationality. Every other memorial across Europe states the Jews were killed by Nazis. Now, they may have been Hungarian Nazis or Romanian Nazis or Lithuanian Nazis or German Nazis, but they're killed by Nazis. There are a number of specific memorials in Poland. The best two examples are Kielce and Jedwabne, where it clearly states on memorials that they were killed by Polish people. They're the only country in Europe where it says that. Now, does this mean all Polish people are good? No. But when we're talking about revisionism, this is the ultimate unrevisionism, that these memorials exist. And the memorials caused controversy when they were put up. The Jedwabne memorial specifically, the locals were very unhappy about it, but the Prime Minister of Poland insisted. I don't know if people are familiar with the story of Jedwabne. Unfortunately, it's most famous because it inspired a apocryphal scene in the movie The Patriot. Because in Jedwabne, a group of Polish people, the day before the Einsatzgruppen would have come in, actually blocked a group of Jews in a church and set the church on fire. This scene appears in the movie The Patriot. That's where it comes from, ironically. Nothing to do with the American Revolutionary Wars. Why the people did it, because they hated Jews or because they wanted to curry favor with the Germans. Obviously, they didn't like Jews if they did it, but it says on the Jedwabne Memorial what happened, and it doesn't say it was performed by Nazi sympathizers. It says it was performed by Polish people. That's not revisionism. I want to state that. And no other country in Europe acknowledges that the deportations were made by their local collaborative government. My family was from the Hungarian administered part of Europe during the transportations, and they were all rounded up by Hungarian army and policemen. They were not rounded up by SS. They were not rounded up by foreign SS volunteers from some other country. They were all rounded up. Now, in the camps themselves, there was something, but they were all rounded up and put on trains by Hungarian officials. So nonetheless, the memorials talk about Nazi collaborators taking them away. It doesn't say that they happen to be local policemen. So yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that perspective on that and unique perspective on so many other things. Having just recently been to Poland, I've heard some of these stories, but I haven't heard them with an Australian accent. So thank you for providing that and for making them relatable to us and our audience. We also heard lots of stories of people who work in the Jewish community who aren't Jewish, and that adds to what you're saying as well. So overall, thank you very much to everyone. I think this was really interesting. There's just a comment as we're finishing up that there's an interview with, in the Jewish News, there's an interview with Michael Zilberman from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So thank you for that. For anyone who's interested, the link's in the chat. But otherwise, thank you, Rabbi Yona. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to everyone who's here. For those who are here and who may be interested, in 2 weeks from today, we'll have another March of the Living event with Yosef Haddad, who Rabbi Yona probably has heard of and knows, an Arab-Israeli advocate of Israel who'll be with us that night. And then later in July, we'll have a tour in Australia of the film J'accuse, which will be which is about Lithuania. So also an interesting part of the Holocaust. So again, more information about that for anyone who's on our mailing list. You'll receive all that soon. And in the meantime, thank you to everyone. Good night in Australia and good afternoon, good morning in Israel. Thank you.